world where we have everything: information, entertainment, food, technology. We lack one thing that can't be bought or downloaded: meaning. This is not a film about depression. It's a film about the hunger of the soul. A hunger that can't be satisfied with likes, promotions, or a life that looks successful by someone else's standards. It's a film about us, people of the 21st century, drifting between freedom and emptiness, between possibilities and losing our direction. So sit down, because maybe today you'll understand why you feel as if you're searching for something you can't even name: the human being as a creature of meaning. We are not like other creatures. A dog doesn't need the meaning of life. A bowl and a walk are enough. A cat doesn't wonder who it is. But we ask, why? Why am I here? Why must I work, love, suffer, fight? Why does my life look like this and not otherwise? Philosophers call us meaning-seeking animals. And this is not a metaphor. It's a biological need, because without meaning, we die. Not physically, but inside. We lose the will to live, even if everything around us says, "You've got it good." That's why rich and famous people often fall into despair, because money doesn't give meaning. And success without meaning is just well-packaged suffering. The illusion of purpose. Culture has found a cure for this. Goals. Study to get a good job, work to get a house, start a family to be happy. Sound familiar? But what happens when you've achieved everything on that list and you still feel empty? It's not laziness, it's awakening. Albert Camus wrote that absurdity is born when a person seeks meaning and the world is silent. The silence of reality is terrifying, because it doesn't give ready-made answers. It doesn't promise that all this has some kind of plan. And in that silence, in that unease, comes the question we fear most. What if I have to create meaning myself? Freedom as a curse. Imagine there are no rules, no divine plans, no pre-written stories, just you, with a blank page. It sounds like freedom, but for many, it sounds like hell. Because freedom is responsibility. It's risk. It's the awareness that if your life has no meaning, maybe it's because you've never given it any. Erich Fromm spoke of the escape from freedom. People prefer patterns, authority, dogma, because then they don't have to think, they don't have to create, they don't have to feel fear. But the paradox is that precisely in that freedom lies the only true meaning, not one given to you, only one you've forged through your own suffering. Meaning as a creative act. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why can bear almost any how," but he didn't say where to find that why, because it doesn't fall from the sky. It isn't born from success, it's born from crisis, from the collapse of old values, from the fall of illusions, from those moments when you think you can't go on, and then you rise. Creating meaning is not poetry, it's rebellion. It's an act of courage in the face of chaos. It's saying, "I don't know if this matters, but I will make it matter." For some, that will be helping others. For others, creating. For others still, a solitary path to self-discovery. There's no single answer. And that's why it's real. A hunger that can save you. That hunger you feel. It's not weakness. It's not an illness. It's a sign your soul is still alive. In a world full of meanings for sale, you're still looking for truth. Don't let yourself be numbed. Don't let yourself be silenced. Don't ask what life has for you. Ask, what will I give to this life? Because only then you will stop searching for meaning and start creating it. And this is where we reach the critical point. Where does manipulation end and strategy begin? Where is the line between influence and abuse? In a world where every gesture can be analyzed and every word can be used as a tool of influence, it's hard to keep intentions pure. But philosophy always comes back to one question: who am I when no one is watching? Because the ultimate battle is not about others. It's about yourself, about keeping inner integrity in a world full of appearances. Masks and identity. Each of us wears masks. This is not a metaphor. It's the reality of daily interactions. At work, at home, in relationships. We show faces that are not always our own. But does that mean we're lying? Or rather that we're adapting to the game everyone is playing? Carl Jung said that this persona, the mask we wear, is essential for functioning in society. But the problem arises when we forget it's only a mask. Because when you start to believe your role is yourself, you lose sight of who you are. And then it's easy to fall into the trap, to manipulate unconsciously, to believe that this is how it has to be, that it's a necessity, that it's strength. But philosophy teaches something else. True strength is freedom from the compulsion to play a role. It's the ability to take off the mask and say, "This is me, with all my flaws, but also with authenticity." In a world of interpersonal strategies, where every emotion can be used as a bargaining chip, Authenticity is an act of courage, not weakness, courage. Silence as a weapon. There are moments when the greatest strength is not what you say, but what you don't. Silence at the right time can shatter more than shouting. People can't stand emptiness. Where there are no words, imagination begins to work. Silence does not mean surrender. Silence can be a refined form of dominance, because when you don't respond, you leave the other person space for unease, uncertainty, reflection. Many philosophers kept silent when others shouted, because they knew truth doesn't need noise, and that those who speak less often rule over those who speak more. Power without outburst. Can you have power without dominating? Can you lead without being a leader by title but by attitude? The quietest people often have the greatest influence. They don't have to impose, their presence is enough. Why? Because power doesn't lie in force but in stability. In those who don't react impulsively, who listen more than they speak, who don't need approval because they know their own worth. That's power that doesn't need proof. Strategy as a path to freedom. And here we reach the climax. It's not about manipulating. It's not about winning every game. It's about not getting drawn into games that lead nowhere. Strategy is not cold calculation. It's the art of conscious living. The ability to see what others don't. The awareness that every word carries weight. That every decision builds or destroys your identity. So, don't be a victim of other people's games. But also don't play your own out of revenge. Act from the center. From silence. From clarity. Because true strength does not lie in controlling others. It lies in not needing to control anyone to be free. But why is it that those who understand the least shout the loudest? Why are those who have barely touched the surface of knowledge so sure of their convictions? The answer may lie not only in psychology but in something deeper. In the philosophical illusion of the ego. In the myth of one's own uniqueness. Philosophers have warned for centuries about the traps of the intellect. Pascal claimed that man is a thinking reed, a fragile being whose strength lies not in physical power, but in the capacity for reflection. Yet reflection is not the same as self-confidence, at least not the kind built on ignorance. And here is where the problem begins. Many people are not seeking truth. They seek comfort, confirmation, reassurance against inner fear. They don't want to know how the world works. They want to believe they already know. That's why it's so easy to manipulate the crowd. That's why propaganda works better on the insecure than on the critical. As Voltaire said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. So perhaps the problem does not lie only in ignorance, but in the pride that grows from it. In the conviction that I don't need to learn, I already know enough. And this brings us back to the greatest danger. The illusion of competence. This is what creates societies full of self-proclaimed experts. People who haven't read a single book in the field they speak about, yet have the audacity to ridicule those who have dedicated their lives to it. That's why Socrates was dangerous. Not to learned people, but to those pretending to be learned. When he said, "I know that I know nothing," he wasn't expressing humility. He was expressing rebellion against the false certainty of the world. Because it is precisely uncertainty that, paradoxically, makes a person wise. Knowledge and the power of illusion. In our times, the illusion of competence has reached a new level. The internet has turned every user into a potential philosopher, doctor, economist, or psychologist. Knowledge has become accessible, but not assimilated. Repeated, but not understood. People no longer distinguish information from wisdom. Algorithms feed us what we want to hear, not what we need to understand. Meanwhile, true knowledge hurts. True knowledge teaches doubt. As Nietzsche wrote, the more a man knows, the more he must forget in order to truly understand. It's not about collecting data, but about transforming it into something alive, an attitude toward the world. And that requires courage. It requires looking in the mirror and saying, perhaps I'm wrong. And today, that is almost a revolutionary act, because society does not reward uncertainty. It rewards certainty, charisma, simplicity of thought. And that is why stupidity can often be more effective than intelligence, because stupidity knows no limits, no shame, no questions. Stupidity acts, quickly, instinctively, without analysis. And intelligence, it stops, reflects, foresees consequences, sometimes for too long. Wisdom as solitude. Perhaps this is why so many wise people live on the margins. Perhaps the requirement we back. Perhaps human trajectory is silence, to unease, to contemplation, to withdrawing from the theater of certainty. As Camus wrote, true freedom is to be alone in a crowd, and perhaps also, to be silent in the midst of shouting. Perhaps when you understand how much you don't know, you no longer feel the need to convince anyone. You feel the need to understand, and that is the most beautiful, yet most tragic quality of wisdom. It's silence, stupidity, and the structure of power. In human history, there is no shortage of moments when stupidity not only survives, but triumphs. Not because the wise were too few, but because stupidity has something wisdom often lacks: mass, numbers, the ability to obey orders without asking questions. That's why totalitarian systems so eagerly feed on stupidity. Because a stupid person does not seek truth, he seeks orders. He seeks a sign that his hatred has a right to exist, that his primitive reactions, anger, rejection, violence, are not only permitted, but desired. As Erich Fromm wrote, a person in an authoritarian society does not want freedom. He wants to get rid of it, to hand over the burden of thinking to someone else, to a party, an ideology, a leader. In this sense, stupidity becomes a tool, convenient, predictable, blind, and yet no one is born stupid. Stupidity is a state into which a person can be led, slowly, systematically, through learned passivity, the destruction of curiosity, and the suppression of critical thinking. This is how empires of stupidity are built, in schools, in the media, in everyday language. That's where the question why is replaced by is it allowed? That's where reflection disappears, and obedience flourishes. Stupidity and morality. The greatest lie of stupidity is its apparent neutrality. It seems harmless, even amusing. Someone doesn't know, someone makes a mistake, someone doesn't understand. But if we look closer, we see that stupidity is rarely alone. It comes with arrogance, with self-confidence unsupported by knowledge, with the belief that everything has already been said, and that nothing more needs to be learned. In this sense, stupidity is not simply a deficit of intellect. It is a moral failing. It is the refusal to see another person as they are, rather than as we want them to be. A stupid person doesn't understand complexity. He simplifies. He divides the world into good and evil, us and them, the faithful and the heretics. And then, according to that simplified map, he builds his judgments, his aversion, his fear. That's why stupidity is not innocent. It is what makes crowds cheer when someone is humiliated. It is what makes people stop reacting when they witness violence. Because if someone is bad, then they deserve to suffer, and empathy is no longer needed. Stupidity, dressed in a uniform, an ideology, or religious fanaticism becomes a machine without conscience. And history teaches us that the worst crimes were not committed by sadists. They were committed by obedient people, stupid, but loyal. Intelligence as an act of courage. So is there a way out? Yes. But it requires courage. Because thinking, truly honest thinking, is an act of risk. It is the risk of admitting we may be wrong, that our beliefs may be flawed, that the people we hate may be more complex than we thought, that the world cannot be locked into simple formulas. Intelligence is not about the number of books you've read. It's about the willingness to ask uncomfortable questions. Wisdom is not just knowledge, it's humility. The ability to admit ignorance. To admit that sometimes we don't know who we are, what we want, or why we suffer. And it's precisely this humility that separates the wise from the foolish. Because a fool never doubts, the wise always. But let's return to the psychological game. Pakiv US about what is a game, if not a hidden contract. Both sides agree, consciously or not, that they will not tell the whole truth. He will pretend to be stronger than he really is. She will pretend she doesn't care that much. Every look, every shift of boundaries, every subtle manipulation is a move on the board where the stakes are emotional dominance. It's no longer about feeling, it's about power over who needs whom more. And that is the greatest perversion. Love, which was meant to liberate, becomes a tool of control. Trust, it becomes an act of risk that can be used as weakness. Closeness, it's no longer warmth but an opportunity to stab a knife under the ribs. Emotionally, of course. Because when you know someone's fear of abandonment, you can control them. When you know someone's needs, you can withhold them, ration them, hang them on a hook. These are not relationships. These are negotiations, masquerades. And then the question arises, is true closeness even possible in a world where everyone plays some version of Machiavelli? Can we love without strategy, without self-censorship, without the fear of being stripped bare to the core of our psyche? Perhaps the brutal answer is no. Or maybe, only a few can bear the naked truth about another person, and about themselves. But in this game there is yet another twist. Those who are the most strategic are often the most afraid. That's why they control. That's why they test. That's why they provoke betrayal before they themselves can be betrayed. They don't want to be the victim, but in this constant attack, they become their own executioner. They destroy the relationship before it can develop, before anything can hurt. And here is the paradox. The escape from pain creates pain. The escape from rejection becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So what to do? First, understand that each of us wears masks. But that doesn't mean we're fake. Masks were once necessary defenses. Perhaps you had to pretend to be stronger because no one listened when you cried. Perhaps you learned to flirt because that was the only way you got attention. Perhaps you learned to withdraw because no one could handle your intensity. These are not flaws, they are survival strategies. But today, if you want something real, you must decide. Do you want to win the game or do you want to be free? Because you cannot control and trust at the same time. You cannot manipulate and love. You cannot play and be authentic. But this brings us to one of the most uncomfortable questions a person can ask themselves. Are we honest with ourselves? Because before we start blaming the world for our pain, it's worth asking, could it be that we have willingly traded depth for comfort? We don't like to admit it, but many of us prefer to remain in a state of emotional suspension. Why? Because depth requires courage. It requires embracing pain, confronting shadows, childhood wounds, grief we swore never to feel again. But without that confrontation, we are like a tree without roots, unstable, swaying with the slightest gust of reality. If we don't understand ourselves, our emotions, our suffering, they don't disappear. They return, stronger, more destructive, more unpredictable. That's why people who seem always nice sometimes explode uncontrollably. Because their love is a mask hiding unintegrated anger. Their kindness is a survival strategy, not an act of freedom. Most people do not fear physical pain as much as they fear themselves. Because when you are alone, truly alone, without your phone, without sound, without stimuli, you are left with only you, and maybe you no longer even remember who that is. That's why so many people throw themselves into a whirlwind of relationships, work, parties, projects. Because the emptiness they feel is too frightening to face. But emptiness is not the enemy. Emptiness is the beginning. It is not the end. It is an invitation. It is the silence before creation. It is the field where something real can be planted. Only, not everyone wants to plant. Because to plant, you have to touch the soil. You have to get dirty, go down to the roots. And that takes courage. The truth is, most people are not afraid of failure. They fear the success that will transform them. Because success requires shedding the identity of the victim. It requires responsibility. And responsibility is terrifying. Because then you can no longer blame anyone. You can no longer say, it's because of them. Because of my childhood. Because of my ex. Because of the system. You must stand and say, it's me. I allowed my life to look this way. And I can change it. The right to play the morally superior role. This is not cynicism. It is observation. Psychological and philosophical. Suffering becomes currency. And some learn to use it, consciously or unconsciously. And that is precisely why inner freedom is so rare. Because it requires giving up that currency. It requires losing an identity built on pain. When you stop being a victim, you have no excuse left. And that hurts. That's why people return to the past. Not to heal, but to remain consistent with their old narrative. We have lived so long with a certain story about ourselves that giving it up would be like dying. And in a way, it is. Transformation is death. The death of the old me. The death of illusions. The death of the comfortable stories we fed ourselves so we wouldn't have to look in the mirror. But it is precisely there, in that silence after the death of illusion, that new life appears.